Okay, thanks very much, Michael. I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm going to take you back to 1969 to start my talk. And the reason for that is, so I'm principal investigator of the 1958 birth cohort study. And I think among, how many of you here know of the British birth cohorts? Is it something that's familiar to, okay, to some of you? So there's 4 national birth cohort studies in the UK. The oldest was established in 1946. I'm PI of the 1958 cohort. The Centre for Longitudinal Studies, there's the 1958, 1970 and Millennium birth cohort studies. So we've periodically followed these large nationally representative groups of initially babies, growing up to adults throughout their lives. And in 1969, when the 1958 cohort were 11 years old, this isn't them actually, but it's a picture I found that I thought might have been them. It sort of resonates that time. I think these, so in 1969 they were 11. I imagine these kids are probably 9 or 10. But in any case, as well as collecting a large amount of kind of quantitative survey data from closed questionnaires of all kinds, they were asked to write an essay. So the kids who were born in a particular reference week that made them part of the study, their schools periodically took them out of the classroom and they did particular kind of tests. And teachers answered specific questions about them. But in 1969, they did something a bit different as well. They gave them half an hour and they asked them to write this essay. So imagine you're now 25 years old. My predecessor in my role, Jane Elliott, called this Imagining the Future. She did quite a bit of work on a kind of qualitative basis on these essays. Write about the life you're leading, your interests, your home life, and your work at the age of 25. So we think around 13,000 children completed these essays. And at the time, they were never transcribed. They weren't intended at that time to be transcribed. They were one of these things that they collected, and they thought maybe in the future people would be interested to look back and see what children have written, which indeed is true. So just to give you a sort of example of what one looked like, and Sharon was rushing to print notes for me because I have on my notes pages transcribed underneath what this actually says. So I'll come up with some more examples that exemplify things that we're interested in. But you can just see here, you can see a few things. First of all, that we have some information redacted. So for use for research, anything that seemed to be very identifiable, like I work in blank blank, we can't show you that because maybe if you put that together with some of the other survey data, you might be able to go back and find who it is. We essentially, the project that I'm going to tell you about, this is quite a long essay, this one. I'll just say a little bit and then I'll tell you about my collaborators. So previously, up until now, the largest sample that people have researched on these essays has been 500 that were transcribed in a previous project. It's been mainly used for kind of qualitative sociological analysis and a bit of what's called quant-qual. So people have took the original 500 that were transcribed a few years back and kind of applied lexicons and dictionaries of different sort of search terms and things like that, and done some sort of semi-quantitative analysis on a rather small sample. So we have a new project which is funded by the ESRC, the core funder of our cohort studies, which enabled us to transcribe the full set of age 11 essays. And essentially, I think what you can't see there is the thing that we're doing with it. We're using machine learning tools that are now very commonly applied to kind of very big sets of text, huge text files, and filled in by millions of people on social media like Facebook and Twitter, to analyze text at scale. We're using some of those machine learning tools on these essays to see what we can learn from them. So our kind of core research question was whether we can learn something from the essays. It's very hypothesis free initially. I think of it as a big data mining exercise at the moment to see whether things that they wrote in their essays are predictive of their future health and well-being. I'll just go back to, it's a collaboration across 3 countries. So myself and my colleague Martina Narayanan at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, where we run the cohort, Peggy Kern at the University of Melbourne, who I've been collaborating with her for about a year on this project, but I met her for the first time yesterday. So I'd previously seen her only by Skype and sometimes in her pajamas because of the time difference. And Andy Schwartz, who's a computer scientist at Stony Brook University in New York, who has a very large kind of set of publications using social media and Twitter to link kind of to identify traits of people and link them to outcomes based on what they write on Facebook and Twitter. And Peggy's a psychologist, so we're a mixed group. So, so some of you said you're aware of the birth cohorts, not everyone. I've already described the NCDS. One thing I'll point out about it, which I sort of love to tell people, so it's a study of all the births in Great Britain in this single week in March 1958. So we're approaching their 60th birthday very soon now. And 98.1% of all babies born in Great Britain were part of the study. So it was an absolutely kind of phenomenal feat of social engineering that I think would be impossible to replicate nowadays. It's exactly like that. Basically in all the hospitals across the country were taking part. So we're in touch now with about 12,500 of those people regularly. And in terms of those, we know that some of them have died. So out of an original maximum sample of about 18,500 sort of responses at a given sweep, about 9,000 or 10,000 each time. You can see the different times when we followed them up. You can see we're down to between 9,000 and 10,000 responses each sweep. It's about 60% of the eligible sample who are still alive and haven't left the UK. So we're sort of proud that we're doing very well. So back to the sort of substance of the project. So I think a lot of you are aware that machine learning is being increasingly used to analyze text at very large scale, as well as to kind of transform our lives in multiple other ways. I think commonly now people have been using it. At first there were very few examples, but I think if I updated this list, it would be kind of longer than the screen in terms of the types of things that people are looking to kind of detect from social media text and then relate to sort of outcomes maybe at a local level or things like that. So depression and social and emotional states, for example, personality traits have been sort of validated as detected against social media text, sort of political sentiment and political ideology, just as some examples. So most of the kind of science, that sort of computer science applied to text at very large scale, has been on adults. So I think one thing that we're realizing, this is very, very preliminary work in progress, you'll see in a minute, but one thing we're realizing is that maybe the tools that have been used to analyze modern text of adults isn't very well suited to analyzing kind of old text of children. So maybe a kind of advance that we're going to make is sort of getting appropriate tools for that. But some of the analysis that my colleagues have done has involved Facebook entries of kids from 13 and up. So we're kind of interested now in focusing on those teenagers maybe in relation to this. So interestingly, I've recently learned that Growing Up in Australia has collected, thank you so much, collected the exact same essay as NCDS at age 11 and 12 of their participants, I think back in 2012. So, and we're now going to pool our data and look together at how things have changed. So we can do that sort of immediately, and that's quite exciting. But to our knowledge, these kind of tools have never been applied to predict traits and see how persistently predictive they are over a long longitudinal setting. So I think there's increasing work in social media, which is called sort of short longitudinal, because people repeatedly post and see how people's sentiments are changing, but nothing that's really looking at whether these things that they're deriving have long-term predictive power. So these are the research questions that we've been looking at. We've literally kind of run these off in the last few days. I think for an international collaboration, there's nothing like a sort of deadline of I'm presenting 3 times in the next week to sort of galvanize findings to come out. So apologies if some of it is a little sort of rough around the edges, but I'm going to tell you in a moment about topics. So the most kind of open content analysis that has the least structure kind of imposed upon it by the researcher, this sort of latent analysis of sort of topics, words that group together, and how prevalent those are in different essays. So we're interested, first of all, in that very sort of open content analysis of letting the essays do the talking and seeing how topics that come up in children's essays both are related to their current circumstances and also their future physical and mental well-being. We're also interested in more kind of active construction of traits. So there's part of the kind of machine learning literature is around training large amounts of text against known sort of traits that are done through survey data or through batteries of expert raters going through and reading a subset of text and then training the sort of larger number of documents, whatever it is, against those things. So we've started to do a little bit of that on the essays as well. So we're looking at whether we can derive measures of cognitive development from the essays. You'll see that there are differences in kind of the complexity of what kids wrote at that age. We're also trying to look at sort of positive and negative emotional states that might be detectable. And this is where I think using things that aren't based on modern constructs is going to be quite important. You'll see we're not very good at delivering those from modern techniques at the moment. So we're sort of interested in kind of letting the data speak. We're interested in deriving specific traits. And then I'm interested in whether the language as a whole, just all the data that we can derive from the language, whether that adds any additional explanatory power to models of future outcomes compared to the survey data. So is there things, even if we don't know what it is, I want to know if there's things that these essays are explaining. I said, I think at this precise time in this project, it feels very exploratory. So I think a lot of the papers on the social media, they're looking for unexpected things as well, and so are we. So the first step, I said, is this very open content analysis. It's a bit like a sort of giant factor analysis with as little structure kind of applied as possible. We've derived 100 topics from the essays, and topics are essentially groups of highly related words and phrases that often come together. It's essentially a sort of latent data analysis. So the only thing that we observe from the essays is words. And essentially, through this particular kind of probabilistic modeling, we construct a set of 100 topics, and every person receives, it isn't a kind of 1-0 binary indicator of whether their essay mentions that topic, it's a probabilistic model, so they're given a kind of a rating from 0 to 1 as to the probability that their essay fits into this sort of unobserved topic. So basically our participants are getting 100 topics that look like these coloured things, and everyone gets a score on all of them. So we start with these 10,000 essays that we've transcribed. They're passed into words and phrases that are these. We run these latent analysis on them, and we end up with these visualizations that probably are quite familiar to you now. So the larger and bolder the text, the more prevalent that word or set of words are in the topics. And there's 100 of these that we've constructed. So I think you're probably interested in what they look like. So here we've just taken topics. So these are from a set of bivariate correlations. So we're not putting the topics all together and letting them compete. We're just putting them in models one by one. These are the ones which are most predictive of being male. So you can see from left to right is so these are the 9 most predictive topics of being male, and they go from, so that's 1 and that's number 9, and you read from kind of left to right and then down. So you can see that the topic that most distinguishes boys from girls is the sort of sports one. I think in terms of, so this kind of content analysis, it's very structure free. You let the sort of data do the talking, but the sort of structure that you then tend to impose is what sort of subjective labels you might put on these topics later. So I think it's quite easy to put labels on those.
Do you allow it to be in different categories?
yeah, you'll see there's a lot of overlap. So I'm kind of having just looked at these very, very recently now, I kind of desperate to reduce them more. So it's interesting that the kind of I guess the default in computer science is to generate as many topics as they can. And I said that there was this sort of rule of thumb of kind of having a sort of 1% of number of topics compared to the number of observations, but a lot of them are very similar. You'll see for girls in a moment. I think my colleagues are very interested in whether these topics are distinguishably statistically from one another, and they're very interested in which ones predict more, even though some of them are very, very similar. But if you now look at girls, and I'm very interested to get the Australian data from contemporary children to see whether they are as distinct, but they are phenomenally sort of distinct. I think if you look at any essay, you would know immediately whether a girl or a boy was writing it in 19. And there may be ones we could do some work on whether you know, putting a propensity model of being a girl or a boy against your language or something, and see how much overlap there is. But they seem very, very distinct. Now, these, just to kind of remind you what these are not kind of the top topics which boys wrote about. These are the models which distinguish boys from girls. So we will run the top topics that boys wrote about compared to the top topics that girls did, and maybe it won't seem quite as extreme as this, but I suspect it probably will, is my gut feel. But this is the first time these have been analysed at very large scale, so we're starting kind of with little steps. Okay, so father's social class at age 11. So another thing I said, I think when you look at these essays, you can kind of tell straight away whether it's a boy or a girl. With a lot of these essays, I think you can tell pretty quickly when you look at them whether they come from a rich or a poor background. And here we've got these bivariate correlations between the topics that have been generated, and we're using father's social class. It's a 1 to 5 variable. Normally you might use a multinomial model, it's ordered, but here we just have it as a linear outcome. And these are the 9 topics that are positively correlated with a higher social class here, and these are the ones which are negatively correlated with higher social class, essentially associated with lower social class. So a few sort of really interesting things stand out. I think you see sort of social capital type constructs coming up here in this top one. Very much enjoying life, interested hobbies, friends, university, large houses, teaching and school seems to come up. So I think maybe you noticed in girls, I didn't really give much dialogue around this. I just kind of let you look at it, but it's the same one as here. I think a lot of girls thought they might be teachers if they came from higher social class backgrounds, and maybe more middle thought that they were going to be nurses. So the teacher one comes up here, ponies and horse riding. And then one thing that's interesting is we asked the transcribers to transcribe the essays as they were written. So I learned that in the growing up in Australia, they've transcribed 2 ways that they're calling clean and dirty. So the clean being correctly spelled, so they can do kind of sociological analysis on what was kind of meant. We've just gone for what's called the dirty one, so we're interested in misspellings as much as the sort of features of what people said. So what you see here is quite a few that are just indicative of things being spelled wrongly, like lots of woods and when spelt wrong. Yeah, eds and ings. But there's also, I'll come back to when we're linking them to future outcomes. There's, we can sort of strip out the misspelling topics and then look at the more substantial ones. But it's very interesting that the sort of mum, dad, brother comes up more in the lower social class children than it does in the higher ones.
Is it likely that the higher classes have nannies and things like that at the time?
yeah, I don't know that we ever captured whether they did, but it's certainly possible that they did. The extent to which their mothers were working was low compared to later cohorts, but whether in the higher ones they may have had some things in any case. So this is this slide is just saying this is linguistic feature extraction. It says under there we've kind of got these words and phrases, and I've already showed you these kind of correlations on the childhood things. But what's really unique about this is looking kind of long term into the future and predictions of those. So we've just started, right? Yeah.
Great focus on words,
yeah.
Words, but also kind of draw back and say the way that ideas have been put together suggests that this child is more, I don't know, has some emotional state or is very focused on bad things happening or this kind of very social.
Yeah. So, so in my introduction, I was. We started with the very open kind of so I'll go in a moment. I'll come on to the more sort of structured analysis of what sentence structure and construction might say about them, or the kind of positive and negative words and things like that. So I'm just spending time on this. It's kind of in 3 chunks what I'm going to tell you. So in terms of these topics and whether they kind of individually sort of predict, we've started just looping through health outcomes in the study in a sort of very agnostic way, but we're already finding that there are some topics which are significantly predictive, and just for example ones that already come up, and these are sort of uncontrolled. So we already know there's social class links to health later in life, and given that these essays are so different by social class, I think you would expect it. In the biomedical suite, we've kind of looped through all the sort of biomarkers that we took when we were in their mid-40s, and not very many of the kind of physical biomarkers have come up yet as being predicted by the essay topics. So systolic blood pressure being one, and mainly these detailed mental health measures that we took when they were in their mid-40s. And I'm told that of all the biomarkers that we took, the one that's most strongly related to mental health at that age is blood pressure. So maybe there's, clustering together of outcomes, but this is by no means a complete set. This is just the kind of initial loop that we've done. But one of the outcomes which is predicted by topics is self-rated general health at age 55. So these are some of the topics which predict general health positively and negatively, and the ones that are in circles are the ones that remain after we stick in some kind of crude controls into the model for social class. So even above your kind of background, it so happens that those who have talked about university and study, for example, and have higher self-rated general health by the time they're 55, and some of these misspelled words are related to lower health later. So I said that, yeah. So this is very basic at the moment. So it's just the childhood social class that we control for, and it's just the age 11. So 5. So we have all this survey data at our fingertips, and we just need to throw it into our models. But I kind of want to start presenting before we're very sort of polished or complete. But just saying that we could strip out the kind of misspelled topics and see which other ones are sort of predictive of lower health later in life. These ones about kind of lovely water and seasides, becoming a hairdresser. And so one interesting thing raised a question about whether the topics can be overlapping and similar. One thing that we noticed is that there is, I think maybe one of the reasons why the computer scientists like to generate like many topics and look at a very disaggregated level before they maybe group things together, is that there are some things which seem quite similar but correlate in a sort of opposite way to future outcomes. So here's 2 topics one that both look like they're about sort of friends, whether one is more about sort of lots of friends, seems to be about sort of quantity, and the other one, which seems to be a bit more about sort of enjoying friends and maybe quality. I think it's a bit sort of speculative, but it is interesting that you, by this kind of data mining, you can kind of uncover unexpected sort of correlations that go in opposite directions, and to think about why. So that's what I wanted to say on the topics for now. I guess another sort of wave of the work is about constructing with more sort of imposing more of our own structure onto the essays to construct traits and then see how they compare against survey constructs of the same types of things. So we were interested initially in whether we can construct scores that capture cognitive ability and to see, as I said, how they correlate with cognitive tests that were taken at the same time, and whether they have any predictive value for future outcomes that we know are sort of causally related to cognition over and above the tests. So we've started very, very simple, and we're going to be building up. So this is probably this is a very simple measure of complexity, which our colleague has generated for us, which is just the average number of characters per word. So using longer words is one sort of potential sign of cognitive development at that age. So here is an example of a high complexity essay, and it's, I think one thing that I wanted to show you is that, one thing I wanted to show you already, I think we can get quite a good sign that these scores, maybe if you can, hang on, this is what it said, that these scores probably aren't as distinguishing of cognitive ability as the cognitive tests, and I'll show you in a minute that you can sort of almost see that visually straight away. But so this one, he used some quite long words. I say he, I'm just assuming. My main interest is in electronics. I'm manufacturing intercoms on a small scale. So apparently a lot of them use the word bungalow. We were very interested. The bungalows come up a lot in somehow the mind's eye of these 11-year-olds. So I was quite happy that we pulled out one. My colleague pulled out one that had bungalow in it. So it's kind of futuristic and technological, but there's some quite long words in there. So one thing, I said we're kind of putting these up against the cognitive tests that we took, and I'll say a bit more about what the cognitive tests were at age 11. I wanted to find you a cognitive test that was sort of visually interesting to compare it to. And so I've gone back to age 7. So this same cohort member, at age 7, they were asked to sort of draw a man. This is not the most predictive cognitive test. These draw a man tests are not as strongly correlated with later life outcomes that, you know, cognition is important for as the kind of verbal and maths and reading tests. But it's kind of nice, you see. So at age 7, they were asked to draw a man, and this cohort member had this score of 26. Someone went through and kind of ticked. I don't know what these numbers meant. But here's a low complexity score. It actually doesn't look that, I kind of thought when my colleagues were sending me back from the UK in the last day or so, these examples that they pulled out of high and low complexity, I thought we'd see one that was like really whizzy and then one was really basic. She was saying, I'm really sorry, they haven't turned out that way. I think actually it's telling us something. Obviously 2 at random is not the answer to the question, but it echoes something that's coming up in the data I'll show you in a minute. So this person's using shorter words. It's not altogether unsophisticated, and their words aren't sort of tiny, but the stars are where it was a bit illegible. I think that's one of the code there, rather than swearing. This was the draw a man test for that person, and you can see that actually they drew quite a sort of tidy picture at age 7. So going on to, you know, this is here for analysis rather than just picking out random individuals. So this is just some descriptive statistics on that complexity score. So girls, on average, are writing slightly longer words than boys. So just these were the tests that were administered at age 11 to the cohort. And these are some just simple correlations. So you can see our complexity score is sort of positively, significantly correlated to some of the cognitive tests that they took. particularly the reading test, as you might think. So you're better at reading, they're writing slightly longer words, verbal ability, but also non-verbal and I don't remember what's under the box, but a general ability test. But you can see also that the cognitive scores are more highly correlated to one another, the actual test, than the complexity. It's quite a crude measure, but it is correlated. Okay, so then looking at outcome measures later in life, because we picked on cognition first, we took some outcomes that we know are strongly related to cognition in later life. So we've taken educational attainment, so employment history. I'll show you some descriptive statistics on the employment history of the cohort, but we've kind of crunched into the number of months that they've been employed. Income, we've taken an average sort of lifetime income measure from the cohort and some cognitive tests that they did at the age of 50. So I just like showing these descriptive statistics because I love the cohort. It's not strictly necessary for the analysis, but here we have from the age of 18 up to the age of 55 the employment status of men in the cohort as they've reported it at each wave. They go back over the previous 5 years or however long since we were last interviewed and told us what they were doing. So this quadrant here is their sort of years in education. You can see that most of them had left education already by age 18, and that sort of predominantly for men, the working status has been sort of full-time over their working lives. It's one of the first to sort of combine child-bearing and work in kind of very large numbers. So you can see from their kind of early 20s onwards, the number who were in full-time employment dropped, but by no means sort of collapsed. Very large proportions working part-time, and then this kind of significant group who were looking after the home. In terms of income, again, this is one of the outcomes that I'm correlating the essays to, but I like these slides. I just wanted to show you what income over a lifetime looks like in this cohort. You can see it's kind of what you would expect. So you have a fairly narrow family income. This is net equivalized income of a couple and any dependent children. There's a sort of pattern of rising income over the life course, and the distribution sort of fans out. So it's what you would expect, but I find it very interesting to sort of see. So in terms of how this complexity score correlates with some of those outcomes, it's highest level of highest educational attainment is here. The number of months that they've reported in employment, which came from those employment histories I showed you, the average of the income measures that we've captured, and then some cognitive tests. So you can see just by looking down the first column that that simple complexity measure is correlated with later outcomes, and significantly so in the direction that you expect. So it's picking up something. If you look then at the sort of general ability test that they took, which is just one of the tests, that is also positively correlated and more strongly so.
Do you have a feel for how much of a predictor it will be over and above the cognitive?
Yes, from this slide here. So here we just have some very simple regression models where we have, I think in column 1, just gender, and then we add the cognitive tests at age 11. And I think we've done a sort of total of all of them to make it nice to be able to present to you what the sort of coefficient on it is. But you might not want to aggregate them to do it sort of thoroughly. And then we have a very sparse set of controls about there, and then a sort of richer set that we're building now so we can make our models kind of bigger. So this one's for educational attainment, and you can see that same sort of positive correlation that I showed on my slide earlier, the complexity score. If you control for all the cognitive tests just at age 11, you can see that actually that still stays positive. It's giving some additional signal. I don't know if we'd added the cognitive tests at age 7 as well, whether it still would. But in terms of other childhood characteristics that we add, it still sort of is providing some additional signal that yeah. So one has, the minimum just has, I think, the region and some indicator of parental social class and parental education. And then we've sort of semi-thrown a kitchen sink at column 4, taking information from birth and age 7 and 11 as well. But it's a slightly haphazard kitchen sink at the moment because we're running these quickly for today. So what we're aiming to do is essentially generate a sort of giant global, which is the full information contained by the survey in a very sort of agnostic way about what that stuff is, and sort of throw it at the model in the same way as we've been using the machine learning in quite an agnostic way. But we haven't fully thrown everything at it yet. So for the other outcomes, the complexity score does not predict over and above the cognitive test at age 11. So you can see that the cognitive tests themselves are predictive of the number of months that you spend in employment, but the complexity just goes to 0, so it's not picking up anything. Likewise for the cognitive, I could have shown you income and the other ones as well, but actually they're just showing the same thing. The cognitive, so childhood cognition and age 50 cognition is highly correlated, but there's nothing about that particular very simple complexity score that's telling us more. So then there's obviously a lot more we can do than just take the average number of characters in a word, and that's our kind of job now. But these are some of the things that we're working on, and I'm just going to show you a little bit on the affect and intensity ones. But just to kind of give you the sort of headline that at the moment, these other constructs that we've started to work on are not correlating well with the scales that were collected at the time from the children that you think that they ought to correlate with. So there's not much kind of obvious validity in them yet, and there's probably some good reasons why there isn't. So I'm going to just show you on the affect and intensity. We're working particularly, so these things are sort of constructs that have generally been trained against modern social media texts with expert raters. But we're also kind of setting up some dictionary type analysis where we're going to collect all the words that relate to physical activity and then see how those predict physical activity later in life. But just to tell you a little bit about the affect and intensity measures which our colleagues have created. So we have on the affect side, it's measuring sort of ranges of positive or negative emotions that that these machine learning models have sort of picked up from the social media text. And then the intensity is these levels of kind of arousal from sort of muted to excited, I would say. When I was putting together these slides, I kind of think I try and keep myself just around here, but I don't know whether it's like different people probably it relates in some way to one, as well as there's probably short-term variations in it and then some kind of long-run sort of place that people maybe find themselves in. But you might think that the sort of detection of positive and negative in the essays, whether they were speaking very positively and optimistically and brightly about their futures compared to sort of negative futures, you would think that might correlate to some of the sort of mental health type measures in childhood. So at the moment, they do in the direction that you would expect, but very weakly so. So this is the Bristol Social Adjustment Guide at age 11. Some of you might be familiar with it if you've used the cohort, but the teachers rated, there are about 200 different sentences about the child, which picked out kind of aspects of their behavior and their kind of emotional adjustment. And at the time, the study grouped it into these categories called withdrawal, depression, and anxiety, and they were given a total score. So the higher positive aspect means it's less likely that you had a score from your teacher of being depressed or anxious, for example. And the Rutter scores were these internalizing and externalizing scales that the parents filled in. And there's a slightly stronger, I haven't done any statistical significance tests on the difference, but there's slightly stronger correlation between the teacher rating and the affect scores, and sort of nearly 0, but they're in the same direction. But the intensity is not showing anything. I'm not sure whether you would expect it to, but there's basically zero correlation there. And these things go on to be not predictive of outcomes, which these things are. So I think, you know, there's more work to do to extract positive or negative. I think there probably are good signals of positivity and negativity in the essays, but the methods that we've kind of applied aren't doing that for us yet, would be my best guess. So this is this question is whether here we've got adult outcomes again, in educational attainment, months in employment and income, and we're just looking at the sort of pseudo R squared from adjusted R squared, sorry, from regressions, where we essentially chuck in all the variables that we've constructed from the essays and nothing else. Here we've chucked in all the variables that we've constructed in that sort of kitchen sink from the survey, and here we've put in both of them. So the very first version of this graph that my colleague sent me from the UK, she'd misunderstood what I wanted in this one. I think she put maybe the minimal set in. And then I was just like really excited because the R squared on here was kind of explaining a bit more. So there's something in these essays that's telling us about their future that the survey doesn't contain. But when she added the extra, and it's not everything yet, that difference has gone away on these outcomes. I think there's a real sort of data mining exercise for us to do to see whether there are some outcomes. And obviously we're still in progress with constructing the variables that we think might be meaningful from the essays. But we're not there yet in terms of what extra is being added. So in terms of my thoughts about where we're at, it's a very early stage. It's the sort of second time I've spoken in public about this essays project, and yesterday was the first time. But I think what I've managed to sort of conclude about where we're at so far is that the mining of modern social media text to derive traits and then to link them to outcomes is very valuable, because the X's are typically very sparse, the kind of explanatory information. You don't have anything until you find the text. You can link it to outcomes, you know, huge populations before and after something happened. So the birth cohort study data, as we know, is already sort of exceptionally rich. And we may find some things, we're still looking, which are novel and different from what the survey collected, that does tell us something unexpected about what predicts their future. But it's not necessarily, obviously, from this first go that we've had of kind of sort of turning the handle, that it's going to serve that very sort of basic purpose. So what is it valuable for? Well, I think it's undoubtedly valuable for sociological narratives. I think most sociologists want to get back to those topics and maybe reduce them a bit and look at the words that children are using and where they've turned out, and tell us some strong kind of sociological discourse about that. And I hope that it is used very actively in that way. So we're about to deposit all the essays at the UK Data Service for people to download and do what they want with them. So I think that there is more systematic data mining that we are kind of doing. I think very obviously, given that they were asked to write about their family and their careers, there's some specific examination of content in relation to what careers and family lives they've turned out to have. We're very interested in comparison with sort of today's children, and I mentioned those Australian essays. I think it may end up being quite informative for the sort of current big fad of big data analysis that's going on, in the sense that, just for example, if we do our very best on complexity measures and then we have these detailed cognitive tests that were repeated throughout childhood, we might be able to say that the tests, that the traits which are being extracted for that kind of work are only capturing a small amount of the kind of true signal that you would get if all social media users also gave you kind of complex batteries of tests. So I wanted to kind of end. Michael, you had asked me, let me just have a look. You had asked me to say something about our project on maltreatment originally from the NCDS. Well, what I'll do, I think I'll just tell you a bit more about the centre that I'm director of and some of the data that we're producing. And then if I may not have time to do the latter, but I can share slides. So I mentioned at the very start, just contextualizing this 1958 cohort, that there are these others. So the UK is very unique in having this series of birth cohorts that have matured to adulthood. We're very proud of them. We run them at my centre, 3 out of the 4. So we are funded as a resource centre. So a lot of my time is spent creating these data sets for you all to use. And a little bit of my time is spent analysing them. So we do scientific development and design of the studies. We consult quite widely at the point when we design our data sweeps, and I would hope that through our networks you would be aware of when we're consulting, and you can have your say about what you'd like to see us to collect in them. We deposit all our data for download. So I have a map that I'm not showing now, but it shows all the kind of downloads from Australia of CLS data sets, and there's quite a big red blob in Melbourne, which so, but I would like it to be bigger. These are the studies. So as well as the birth cohort studies that I mentioned, we have recently taken on a 4th non-birth cohort study. So there was this 30-year gap between the commissioning of the 1970 cohort and the commissioning of the millennium. So there might have been a 1982 birth cohort. There was very detailed plans drawn up, and then it failed to be funded in the sort of tough funding climate of Thatcher's Britain. So the Department for Education started in the early 2000s a cohort born in 1989 and 90. So they took English school children in the year 9 when they were 13 and 14 and followed them through their school years. And the Department for Education stopped following them, and the ESRC has commissioned us to pick them up, and we've interviewed them at age 25, and they partly fill that gap. So we have from their teenage years onwards, and we're proud to have retraced that cohort and to bring them along. So in terms of the types of questions, so I've just been giving a talk on one project, and we're looking at the kind of long-term effects of early childhood circumstances. That's one of the very sort of major uses of our studies. They're also very heavily used for kind of looking at intergenerational transmissions, because the parents start as the original study participants, in a sense, signing their babies up. We get a lot of information about them. As the cohort members grow up and become adults themselves, we start to ask questions about their own children. Lots of people use them for analysis of kind of individual change over a lifetime. So I showed you those very basic kind of income trajectories that we're actually just using the data as pseudo cross-sections, but people model individual change a lot using them. There's various kind of different clever natural experiments that are built into our cohorts that people have used. And increasingly, we're using our cohorts together rather than individually to show differences over time. So we're looking at sort of mental health changes across our cohorts. The younger cohorts are, the 1970 cohort, for example, is, although it has a higher income and higher levels of education to the 1958, they're typically more depressed, significantly so. Not something you knock out by various kind of statistical means. Younger cohorts are more obese, very much more so. So we're sort of looking at reasons for cross-generational change using these. So this is how you can get our data. In terms of like what's happening now, so we have just released the age 14 sweep of the Millennium Cohort Study. It was the biggest and most ambitious data collection that we've done on any of our cohorts to date. So they all wore physical activity monitors, and they also had at age 7. So obesity among this generation is a very major kind of scientific issue. We now will have 2 kind of observations of their physical activity. And we took saliva and have extracted DNA and are genotyping the Millennium Cohort and natural parents. They did time use diaries using an app, and we're about to release the time use data alongside the sort of mutual survey data that you might like to see. And I already mentioned the age 25 sweep of next steps. Just one thing that was all over the UK press a few weeks ago. Surprisingly, we don't have good information about the prevalence of mental health problems among teenagers today in the UK. So we looked at the strengths and difficulties questionnaire reported by parents, but we also looked at the short moods and feelings questionnaire that had been self-reported by the cohort. And you see a very big disparity between parental reports of feelings of sort of depression and internalizing symptoms compared to self-reports among the girls, and basically a very big jump of self-reported sort of indicative of self-reported feelings that would be indicative of depression. So 1 in 4 of every girl reporting high levels of depressive symptoms. And we think that probably is a big jump from previous cohorts. We're working on that now, thinking about their social media kind of interactions and various things related to that. In next steps, so we also find about 1 in 4 reporting, and this is on the GHQ, General Health Questionnaire, reporting symptoms indicative of depression. And we are sort of linking that in this was the short briefing that we put out to advertise the new age 25 data, but we found kind of strong associations between not being employed. So the youth labour market for this generation has been exceptionally tough, and kind of strong, as you would expect, associations between not working, but also being in sort of more insecure work and mental health problems among the cohort. So here we'd ask them whether they were on 0-hour contracts and whether they were doing shift work. And you see the sort of things that you might expect. So I will finish by telling you about this conference that we're running that we've just issued. There's a call for papers open now. We would dearly love to, do not have to be using NCDS, so it's a conference which celebrates 60 years of NCDS. But if you're doing work on any of these topics, on any data, and particularly if they answered the kinds of questions like that, then we would love you to submit. You could submit a session, you could submit a paper. Please come visit us.
Interesting, going back to the initial results you were presenting on topics and
yeah.
And how they were associated with parental socioeconomic
Yeah.
background, and the fact that the low socioeconomic characteristics is primarily about literacy.
It appeared to be, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, could you sort of explore among the sort of those from poor socioeconomic backgrounds? Are there topics, are there phrases that predict those who are going to escape the circumstances?
Yeah. Yeah. So undoubtedly we can. Yeah, undoubtedly we can. It would be good. Yeah, it would be very interesting to do that.
I'm going to go similar kind of comment around the question. Oh, firstly, really similar, I thought it was really interesting knowing that there's career and education aspirations. Which ones, which dreams kind of got broken,
yeah,
and why?
Yeah.
So, whether they're high or low, why
Yeah.
dreaming of going to university
Yeah.
at age 11, and as low as it's less likely to realise their dreams.
Right.
Or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because that SES predicts the types of dreams,
Yes.
but then the interaction of
Yes.
particular.
Yes.
Really
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Not just,
Yeah.
education, but career, family.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was also just another related to sort of trying to say what they asking about what they were looking for in jobs.
Mm-hmm.
One question was, so the kids are really money focused,
Mm-hmm.
and then whether the happiness return from getting money was strong for those kids.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
actually were really money focused
Yeah.
when they were young.
And what was the answer?
We were kind of getting it, but the data wasn't
Yeah.
so good at
Yeah. Yeah.
much better data.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you want to, so I'm like a sponge to absorb your suggestions as what we should do, but I guess the beauty of these cohorts is that you can also, if you want to revisit that question and use this, then very soon, I think from early Jan, you'll be able to get the essays and crunch them yourself in any way. So, to extend that work or something like that, please do. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell them the aspiration at age 11? Is that something?
One of the things that predicts. So so lots of people have worked on what enables people from low socioeconomic backgrounds to escape, I guess, and they've looked at it in sort of each of the cohorts. Seems to be parental interest in the child's education is one of those sort of variables. Whatever you think the causal model underneath might well be that or something else. And cognition, however generated, is strongly supports that sort of jump. But looking again now that we have all these extra kind of variables, I think is kind of would be a nice thing to do. Yeah. Right.
Like, I don't know whether they've seen themselves at that young age being successful later on, whatever.
Yeah. 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 I mean, maybe that is where we will find some more signals in here than we've currently on our first kind of turn of the wheel found. Yeah, maybe we will. And that would be, yeah, I'd like to let you know.
I think you've answered the first of my two questions, which was, do you have examples of interventions which can actually predict what it is that people have in the trajectory?
Yeah.
The other question was, amongst the data that you've given us, did you find anything which was really counterintuitive? Because most of the data you've given us is really interesting, but probably not all that surprising.
Yeah.
The way things
Yeah.
work. Have you found something which really contradicted your intuitions?
So not yet. I mean, I think we found, like on the kind of affect and intensity measures, for example, I think we found that they're probably not very good yet. We need to work more on them. But it may be that if we work a lot on them and we think they're excellent measures and then they're not predictive of future outcomes, then that might be a surprise. But no, I think that a lot of these projects that our colleagues work on with the sort of machine learning, they're looking for the unexpected, and that it doesn't necessarily jump out at the, well, I thought maybe it would jump out already, but we're still working on it.
You were able to take physical activity from the text. Were you able to detect anything about dietary traits?
Maybe. So we haven't tried to, but I think you can, the software would let you put, I guess what traditional kind of quantitative, qualitative analysis is done using kind of dictionaries of words that people have by one means or another identified as being associated with things. So you could straightforwardly kind of think of a lot of kind of dietary stuff and find out if there's much in there. We haven't noticed it. It hasn't jumped out in any topics. I haven't seen anything about food.
Then you can relate physical activity, dietary.
Yeah.
Together.
Yeah, I think ice cream is the one that I can think of that's come up in the seaside topic. Yeah, but I haven't. I don't think people really wrote much about what they were eating. I don't think, but I haven't queried it, statistically to find out. We haven't looked. I don't know. Probably be interesting.
I just had more of a suggestion than anything else. With regards to the work histories that you've actually included, at the moment what you've got is something that's quite starkly measured, i.e. number of periods that they're employed. The work history data that you've got would actually lend itself really nicely to actually doing frequency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And group people according to,
yeah.
For example, it might be that you find that time employed is equivalent to, say, time in education. And that you can actually group people together in class and having one continuous variable, you can actually have something that's got multiple categories.
Yeah. So people are doing sequence analysis in other applications. We haven't gotten as far as thinking about that in relation. So we have got as far as thinking about sort of latent trajectory sort of groupings of explaining long adult lives in different domains. But I guess there's a certain investment that is taken. So we would probably want to see that those cross-sectional outcomes somehow were predicted to sort of help guide us as which way to look. But I think looking at so we have family histories that look a lot like these work histories as well. So whether you were married or cohabiting or single or whatever. So you can do the same. People are doing sequence analysis both on the employment and the family data. So yeah, linking them probably next step.
You may have covered this already, but in the analysis of this, distinction between the complexity of the language and the complexity of the ideas. So someone could be talking about a complex idea with simple language.
Yeah. So I don't know. I suspect probably so. The stuff we've done is very, very basic. So we are. I think there's things like this. It's not really the. It's. Yeah, I think I don't. Besides, like reading them all, there's. Sorry, I'm trying to look at this. There's things like the number of subordinate clauses within sentences, but again, that's not conceptually. That's not conceptual complexity. That's just, you know, sentence structure. Yeah. I suspect that there is more that we can do. Yeah. I think there are, you know, software that you can license that generates whole batteries of measures that we haven't done. That is another step just to kind of feed it through and see what comes out. So, but exactly how I think our so our colleague was looking at trying to create something which was creativity, which was around the number of kind of novel words in the essays compared to the general sort of corpus of words that are represented here. So, you know, if everyone's using bungalow, then it's not as creative a word as, you know, only one person said intercom, or, you know, that kind of thing. We've already have started to create that, but that's maybe a little more like what you said, but yeah. Oh, yeah.